Every journey begins with a single step, but for Joram van Klaveren, a man born and raised in a devout Protestant family in Amsterdam, his path took him places he never expected.
Before I was a Muslim, I was a Protestant Christian from the Reformed Church. Of course, I believed that there is a creator. I believed in heaven, hell. I believed in angels, revelations. And of course, what separates the Christians from the Muslims is that I believe that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. But because the Trinity is a very complex concept, whether you believe it or not, it's still very complex. Because if there is a God in the Bible, it says God is eternal. But if you are eternal and you die, you cannot be eternal, immortal at the same time. I still believed in God. I still believed that Jesus was a very important person. I believed he was the Son of God, but how it exactly was, I left it for what it was.
This internal conflict with the Trinity marked the beginning of Joram's spiritual journey, but he didn't know that it would lead him far beyond the faith he was born into. In 2001, the world changed with the attacks of September 11th. Joram, like many in the West, saw Islam as a growing threat. The murder of Dutch filmmaker Theo van Gogh by a Muslim extremist only intensified his fears. Fueled by this atmosphere, Joram entered politics, determined to fight what he perceived as an enemy.
I became politically active for the Freedom Party. I became a member of parliament, and in the end I decided to write an anti-Islam book.
To solidify his stance, Joram began writing a book to explain why Islam was incompatible with Western values. But in the process of researching and writing, something remarkable happened.
When I was writing my book, like I said earlier, the questions, the doubts I had about Christianity popped up again. And that was about truth, of course, because I was a believing Christian guy. And yeah, the Christian questions I had in the end were answered in an Islamic way. Because, of course, when I started writing the book, a lot of people think that it was a political book. But it wasn't so much a political book, it was a religious book, because I wanted to show people why Islam was a danger as a religion. And I wrote it from a Christian perspective. So in the beginning, I made a comparison between the Christian concept of God and the Islamic concept. So I started comparing it. But because I had these doubts about the Trinity and I saw Tawheed, the oneness of God in Islam, I thought, yeah, it sounds a little bit more logical.
As his doubts grew, Joram reached out to Islamic scholars. One of them was Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad from Cambridge University. What began as an adversarial exchange became a pivotal turning point.
One of the guys that I wrote to was Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad, and he's a professor from Cambridge University. I told him I'm writing a book. I have a lot of questions. So I was very plain why I thought, why is Islam promoting terrorism? Why is anti-woman? Why is anti-Christian? Anti-whatever. After, I think, 6 weeks, he sent me a very extensive email, and he started explaining, directly answered a lot of my questions, but he also told me, you have to read this article, read this book, read that book, ask this person. And so he was very extensive in his way of explaining. But in the end, after I read all these books and articles and made a comparison between prophets from the Old Testament with Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, I had no arguments anymore to say they are prophets and he is not. And I thought to myself, well, if I accept Moses on these grounds and I cannot accept the prophet, then there is something else.
Joram then turned his attention to the life of Prophet Muhammad. The more he read, the more his misconceptions began to unravel. No longer a figure of violence, Joram saw Muhammad as a man of mercy and character.
She was the wife of one of the enemies, Abu Sufyan, and in a way they gave money to kill Hamza, the favorite uncle of the Prophet. And that was what happened on the battlefield. He got killed. They even paraded with his ears and cut off his nose and horrible stuff. So the Prophet was deeply sad, of course, of what happened. And years later, he became powerful. He came in power in Mecca. And then there was Hind. And I was reading this book and I thought, okay, now she gets crucified or her head gets cut off or something like that. But he said, well, I cannot look at her right now, but everybody is forgiven. And if you want to stay here and live among the Muslims, it's possible. If you don't want that, you can go. But bloodshedding is over now. And I thought to myself that she was forgiven. If you can forgive someone who kills a relative, especially a favorite uncle of you, even starts parading with parts of his body to show other people that she humiliates you and whatever you stand for, that means you have such a great character.
Then, something extraordinary happened. One night, as Joram was putting away his books, the Quran fell from his shelf. When he picked it up, his hand landed on a verse from Surah Al-Hajj, chapter 20 to verse 46.
And it says it's not the eyes that are blind, but the hearts. And I thought to myself, that really is my problem, because it wasn't the eyes. I really could see what I'd written down myself. Nobody forced me to write this book. Nobody said you have to write this or that. I started writing myself, and I could see it with my own eyes, but I still couldn't accept the fact that I said, he is a prophet, there is this one God. I just couldn't. So it wasn't my eyes that were blind, but it was really my heart.
That night, Joram prayed, asking for a sign. And the next morning, he woke up with an overwhelming sense of clarity and peace.
When I woke up, I felt very secure in myself. I really felt very secure. I've never been more secure about anything else. The whole anxiety or the whole doubting issue, it disappeared like snow for the sun. And I thought to myself, well, I think I'm a Muslim. Well, and then of course I had to tell other people.
But embracing Islam was just the beginning. The real challenge was telling his family and friends.
A lot of people, especially some uncles and aunts, it was kind of a shock. I told my mother, and my mother started crying. And my wife was pretty open. Yeah, she was very cool about it. And yeah, some people from my old work were really aggressive. I got over 2,000 death threats from people who used to support me, of course. People who voted for me. People said the most horrible things. We will rape your wife, shoot you, we know where your children go to school, stuff like that. And so it was kind of a hectic time. And I had to tell my work, of course, and it was this Christian organization. So to say, the leader of the pack, he said, I can't believe it. And he said, well, I noticed this change when you talked about certain topics on radio. You were kind of a little more mild, not so harsh anymore, but you becoming a Muslim. But the hardest part for me was telling my grandfather, because my grandfather was dying, and he was 93, 94 years old, and he was on his deathbed at home. I had to tell him, and my mother told me, yeah, you have to tell your grandfather. It was her father. So I said, well, then you have to come with me. It's kind of like a shield. And then I just said, well, grandfather, I became a Muslim. And then he closed his eyes. And I thought he stopped breathing because he was so old, and he really stopped breathing for a while. And then he started breathing again, and he looked at me and he said, well, at least you didn't become a Catholic.
One of the most significant moments in Joram's new life as a Muslim was performing his first Salava Muslim prayer. It was a humbling experience, bowing in complete submission to the Creator.
As a Christian, you're not used to pray like that. You pray with your hands together and perhaps on your knees in front of your bed or something. But I think it's very beautiful that you really prostrate, so you really bow down in the deepest way for your Lord. So that's a very humbling, beautiful thing, I think, and that, it made me feel very happy.
Joram now dedicates his life to undoing the harm he once caused. He founded the Islam Experience Center, where he educates people about Islam and works to dispel misconceptions.
I think Islam is a lie, because that's something I used to say. Islam is a lie, the Quran is poison. Yeah, that's something that bothers me, and that's one of the reasons that we founded an organization. It's called the IXC, Islamic Experience Center, and we go to schools, primary school, high school, college, universities, but also to departments of the government, other social organizations, churches, to take away misconceptions about Islam, to share the message, to show Islam in its true colors. And we do it by virtual reality with the glasses, so it's a very fun experience as well. And we try to erase in a way the things I said and done in the past.
Joram's journey was long and challenging, but in the end, it brought him to a place of peace and purpose. His advice to others is simple.
No, I think it's very important that people read books, real books with pages and stuff. I would recommend Muhammad, His Life Based on the Earliest Sources of Martin Links, the book I talked about earlier. It's a green book. And I think it's very important for people not just dive into the Quran, because it's a very complex book. And if you don't have anybody who can teach you what you read, especially most of the people who don't know anything about Islam are not fluent Arabic, classic Arabic speaking people. So you will read an interpretation of the Quran or a translation, and most of the time that's not the real deal, of course. So I would advise people just to study the Sirat, study the character and the life of the Prophet, because that's what the tradition teaches us as well. His life was the Quran. He was the living Quran in a way. Just study his Sunnah, and I think that is the best way of discovering Islam.
From an anti-Islam politician to a devout Muslim, Joram van Klaveren's story is one of transformation, forgiveness, and the relentless pursuit of truth.